All right, thanks everyone for coming to our session here for planning large-scale account provisioning for Microsoft Teams rooms and shared devices. The screen is right underneath the light, so if you have issues seeing, come a little closer because Michael's going to do some demos for us. My name is Habib Mankal. I'm a Microsoft MVP, Principal Architect and Consultant at Wavecore IT, which is my company. That's my Twitter handle and my website if you wish to follow me. And Mike, go ahead, Michael.
Sure. I'm Michael LaMontagne. I'm a Microsoft MVP as well. In my day, I help customers and partners on their team's journey. So that might be enterprise voice, devices, or extensibility. And then I also am the Principal Product Manager for Teams Boss. That's really taking these customer scenarios that are reoccurring and either building custom solutions or SaaS offerings around that. And you can find me on Twitter at realtimeuc. We're also a member of the podcast group at o365a.com. And we post every second Tuesday an episode, except for yesterday.
Except for yesterday, I'm posting this morning. Yeah. So as all four of us are Canadian, and we have one of our fellow members here, Dino Caputo, as well. So you can reach us at our blog site, o365a.com, or youtube.com/o365a.
Yeah, we just take 10 to 15 minutes usually to talk about business perspective of some of the changes that are happening around Microsoft 365 stack.
Yeah, and we just want to obviously thank our sponsors for this event. Obviously, without them, we wouldn't be able to have these events put on. So please make sure that you go and visit them outside in the expo area. Okay, so for the agenda, basically what we want to do is, if you have a large scale enterprise deployment where you have a lot of rooms or you're going to be onboarding a lot of rooms, we want to sort of show what the automation experience could be, for those kind of things, right? So obviously with that, we have to talk about, different account types, what the licensing requirements are going to be, the implications of that. How do we secure them, right? Because we all have those discussions with our security departments, especially when we want to turn off specific security features, and they get all upset. And then building the process, and then what are the potential roadblocks that you might encounter when you're provisioning these type of endpoints. So from an account type perspective, the ones that we're talking about today is going to be meeting rooms and common area phones or shared devices, something that has a shared account will be utilized in that sense. So, from a meeting room perspective, we're talking about, Exchange resource that's bookable, auto-responding back to you, calendar processing, whether we want to allow external access for meetings to, to get processed, forwarded in as well. They are licensed accounts, right? They are, in the olden days, you'd create a resource and it was an AD account that was disabled, that wasn't signed in, but because these are actually signing into actual physical devices or endpoints, the accounts need to be enabled as well. Same thing for the common area phones or the CAP phones. They are a user account. They are licensed differently as well. And then you do have the ability to perform some sort of UI restriction on them because they're for a specific feature. Generally, those type of phones are in like a lobby area or lunchroom or something like that, just to be able to give those kind of dial tone or functionality, for your end user base.
And everyone's favorite topic, first thing on the second day of the conference, licensing. So if we're talking about resource accounts that are bookable in Exchange, no license required. Once we start putting those onto devices, maybe kitchens, lobbies, hot desking spaces, we have the shared device license. That was the old common area phone license. This device could also be used for scheduling panels that are not tied to an MTR, the Teams panels. So this is really that kind of common non-user device that's used by multiple users. We then have the Teams Room license, and so a lot of changes here. It kind of breaks down into two parts. We have Basic, which I try to pretend doesn't exist. It does have a limit of up to 25 in your tenant, so you can't go beyond that. But there's a lot of limitations with this license. So free, you get exactly what you pay for. You get a single screen, not dual. You don't get remote management. You don't get Azure P licensing, so exclude from conditional access for MFA and stuff like that. So I tend to think of it as something to avoid, and then really plan around Pro. If you're going to refresh the technology in your room, make sure you're budgeting around Pro. You're piloting, get the Pro trial. You can get 25 licenses for 30 days with no charge. You can extend that another 30 days if you put your credit card in there, again, no charge. So do that in your pilot versus using a free license and limiting the experience. Some people might be grandfathered into the standard and premium licenses, but those are kind of going away once your EA renewal or your licensing terms are up. So plan around Pro for these bookable rooms. The other thing I forgot to mention is if you're going to license a Starfish phone, so just an audio device that is in a room, if you want the one-touch join experience from the calendar, you do have to go with a Pro license. So you can't use the common area license unless you're just going to use it for dial pad. But if you need the one-touch join, you're going to need Pro as well. On the telephony side, so if we start taking the ability to put the dial pad and call the PSTN network, we have a few options. So if you're going to use Microsoft's telephony service, there's a couple different plans. We have domestic, international, and consumption-based. Unlimited inbound, you pay for your usage on outbound. And then of course, lots of sessions around Operator Connect, but we have direct routing and Operator Connect. Your telephony is going to be priced based on that carrier or that service provider. And then anytime you're going to use toll-free from Microsoft, or you're going to use something like the pay-as-you-go licensing on calling plans, you're going to use communication credits. So this is buying a prepaid bank of minutes, and then you're going to consume that with these pay-as-you-go services.
Yeah. So everybody's favorite topic, security, right? So I did a session last year on, I guess all of the security functionality, for these MTR rooms. And it's always interesting to hear some of the discussions that you have with the security teams, especially when you tell them that, hey, we need to disable MFA on all these accounts, and then they just lose it, right? So, there are other things that you have to put in place when you turn that functionality off, right? Because obviously there's nobody going to be there, authenticating all these endpoints, especially if you have thousands of these endpoints or meeting rooms and stuff like that. So, from a security perspective, how do we secure them? There's two specific ways, and within there's, obviously some things you can do. So the first one is applying conditional access to all of these accounts, and the other one is if you're using Intune or Endpoint Manager, so device compliance capabilities as well. I'm not going to be talking around the device compliance section because I could probably take a full hour just specifically on that. So the conditional access side of things, really, how do we go about securing these endpoints, right? So first thing you want to do is we'll just talk about sort of the fundamentals here, right? We have assignments where you have include users or groups. What you probably want to do is when you have the AAD P1 license, use dynamic groups to have these accounts get automatically put into these specific groups, which then automatically get put into your conditional access policies after they're all set up. Naming conventions is very important. So make sure that you have the appropriate naming conventions for your rooms, depending on how large your organization. If you're a multinational organization as well, you want to make sure that you name things appropriately so that you can build your dynamic group queries appropriately so that they get put in the right groups. The conditions that we have, device platforms, location is very important as well. That is one that I always recommend too, so that when your device is signing into M365, it's going to be coming from a specific public IP address, and you need to put that IP address as an IP location, because then you can assign that to a conditional access policy and say, yes, if this account is at this location and it's signing in, allow it to go through, right? And then what are the different cloud apps that we want to allow, and then do we want to block or grant, and do we allow Intune compliance capabilities as well, right? So as I mentioned before, so name locations is important. if you have, like I said, either a multinational or even like, within your organization, you have different cities or states that you're in, you obviously want to make sure that it's locked down per location because it's coming across that wire. Unless you're doing like a site-to-site VPN and all of your network is basically traversing over that VPN and going out a single egress point. So make sure you have these these conditional access name locations. So and it's the public IP address. So it's not the actual local IP address of the endpoint itself. So make sure you have that in place. And then once you're there, you want to create a conditional access policy here. So you can either have a dynamic group or you can have like single accounts as well. So once you have that configured, next thing you want to do is you want to select the appropriate cloud app. So you don't want to configure everything to say all cloud apps. For these MTR devices, you really only want 3, right? You want Office 365 Exchange Online, you want Office 365 SharePoint Online, and the reason you have that is to use the whiteboard functionality. So if you don't have that turned on, then you can't use the whiteboard functionality within the MTR space. And then obviously you need Microsoft Teams because you got to join those meetings, right? So you want to scale it down to those specific applications in themselves.
And you do need the pro licensing to do all this conditional access.
Correct, yeah. So you need at least Azure AD P1, right, to configure these conditional access policies and dynamic groups, right? So for that enhanced capabilities. And then you sort of, you have the device platform. So, are these going to be, this policy is just for my Android devices? Is it going to be for my Windows devices? What version do I have within them as well, right? And then, this is the next one over here is we say, okay, well, maybe I have a conditional access policy for these devices and then I want them to allow from these IP addresses, right? So we're narrowing down the scope of where these endpoints are going to be coming in from.
Without MFA.
Without MFA, and lowering the security's anxiety, when you're going through this. And then this was actually last year when I was going through it, this is actually new, so that you have the ability to filter on devices. So this was really cool. So now you can even lower it more because you can say like device display name contains neat or poly or whatever your naming convention is, right? Or even like the device type. So now you're saying like, I'm at this location, I have this version of Android, the actual device identifier of the physical appliance is this, right? So then, the scope is getting lower and lower. And then obviously, you can say, okay, from browser or mobile app, you want to be able to have that access. And then your policies applied. And then basically you say, okay, well, I want to grant access. And I say, okay, require approve client app, or if I'm using, endpoint manager, is my device marked as compliant? Anybody using endpoint manager in Intune? Show of hands real quick. Okay, it's a couple. Yeah, so with endpoint manager, you have the ability to specify these different compliant policies to say like, okay, do I have firewall enabled? And I mean, these are more on the Windows devices, but like the Android ones, you can say it has to be a specific version, these different apps. And then the endpoint itself has the client or reports back to Intune to say, I have all this stuff on my endpoint. And then endpoint manager will say, you are compliant, will sort of give you like a green check mark. And then the endpoint manager will then give that information to Azure Active Directory, and then it will approve that device for the sign-in. So it matches that criteria. So it's also an additional security enhancement. Okay, so in smaller organizations, generally, things are more agile, but in large enterprises, as you can see here, it takes weeks for organizations to provision resource accounts to onboard Microsoft Teams Room and how we streamline the process.
Thank you. So I'm not sure if anyone can relate, but converting or creating accounts that are signing into devices are kind of a different way of creating accounts for most enterprises. So kind of following the process in one of our customers was, hey, we have the project management office would create a ServiceNow ticket, it'd go to the Azure AD team, the Azure AD team would say, oh, it's a resource account, throw it to the Exchange team, the Exchange team would create it, throw it back to the AD team, AD would sync it to online, then Exchange would move it to Exchange Online. Then we would have it go back to the PMO and they say, hey, we're done. And then the PMO would go, hey, it needs to sign into a Teams device. So they reach out to the Teams group, and the Teams group kind of gets the burden to make this work. So they would reach out to AD to get passwords set, you get the account enabled. It would reach out to the Exchange team to get the calendaring processing correct so that the join button would actually show up. Mail tips, maybe showing that, hey, it's a Teams enabled room. Maybe even just the auto reply, including some content on how to use the room. So kind of that collaboration. Going to security and dealing with the bypass MFA, getting the devices through password expiry, and then validating and all this. So this process can get drawn out, especially as you're passing it through groups that may be siloed. And then if you have ServiceNow, even though you're trying to follow maybe the SLA on the workflow, it starts to get drawn out, especially if you start putting weekends in and other teams projects, then we start to see this timeline expand and expand. So I'm not sure if anyone can kind of relate with the back and forth, even if it's just with security and the Office 365 team, but there is, it's not going to be provisioned in 20 minutes.
Well, the security talk has happened like way before this, so you got about
But every time on a new account.
3 to 6 months, right? Right. So from a small, I guess, deployment, if you want to do some automation, what you're thinking, maybe what you could deploy within your organization, be like, okay, I could probably build a Microsoft list with like a form on it that somebody can come and fill out, and then I have an Azure Logic app that basically listens in, on that SharePoint list site when an event gets fired, and then it sort of goes through the process to say like, okay, I'm going to process, all of the configurations, and then I'm going to take that and I'm going to put it into Azure Automation. So basically, it's the ability to run PowerShell scripts. So I basically am taking like all of the JSON that I'm getting from the Azure Logic app, and taking that and then provisioning like maybe new, they're basically new Exchange mailbox or new mailbox, a new Azure AD user. So I'm just firing all these single line PowerShell commandlets to provision that type of account, right? And then you can get away with something like this when it's, like I said, a relatively small environment, you're managing it, and there's not a ton of workflows and stuff like that you have to. Don't freak out, but this is what you're going to have to do.
So we came into a project thinking, hey, yeah, Microsoft List, maybe a Power App fronting it, but then we found out that there was a complex logic around naming. So what is the display name going to be? What is the UPN going to be named? And depending on site, region, division, that all changes. So we had to build a whole engine around that. So if we kind of go through that, and I'll kind of zoom in, at least on my side. So you would collect the data from the project management group. So hey, we're going to deploy this room at this site. It's going to be maybe in this location. Here's all our data. Validate that data. So based on what they provide, what additional information we need to actually create the account. After that, did someone already create that account? Does that UPN already exist? Are we going to cause a conflict? So now we have to do some validation. Is this account going to be a room? Because hey, maybe it's not just for MTRs. Maybe we want to book common area phones, or maybe we want an audio device in a room. So have to think about, depending on how the account's created, I'm not sure if we're getting feedback, do we have to create the account in Azure AD, or do we create it in Exchange? Exchange, we get to create it so it's bookable. AD might be just for a common area phone. After that, and so now we start getting into the PowerShell kind of thinking. When you create an Exchange mailbox, doesn't actually mean that mailbox exists. There is a delay after creating it before you can actually interact with it. So now we have to think about maybe durable functions, monitor that account to see when it comes up. After that, if you're going to start provisioning calendaring settings, like, hey, it's going to be, don't delete the subject, or whatever attributes we need for a room, well, when you create a mailbox, the calendar doesn't get it provisioned right away. So if you start kicking off calendar commands to set the calendar, you need to monitor when that calendar is available for that. And then if you're going to do mail tips, maybe you're going to do a custom message. So how are we going to put that in? And then going from that, hey, is the mailbox going to be hidden from the gal? Maybe it's only for executives. Is there delegated management of these calendars for maybe executive assistants? And then are we going to populate attributes in places, so like capacity or what equipment's in the room, so that when you look it up in Room Finder, what are you able to kind of get from that information? Then we wait for the Azure AD account to be there, and then we have to think about licensing. So depending on the account, maybe we're applying custom attributes to do dynamic groups. Maybe we're putting them into specific groups, maybe because you don't have dynamic groups, or maybe you're applying licenses directly to these devices, depending on your organization. So we have to think about that workflow. Maybe the device doesn't actually need a license. Maybe it's just a bookable room with no technology in it. Then after that, do we have a phone number? If we have a phone number, we're going to put it in the Azure AD side so that it shows up on the profile card, so you can actually see what the contact number is. If it's going to be provisioned for a dial pad in Teams, now we have to go into the Teams realm. So is it going to be, what policies, dial plans, voice routing policies if it's direct routing, the phone number assignment. So there's a lot to think about when
international calling.
Yes. So there's a lot to think about as we start to break down these chunks in a complex environment. So what does it look like? So this is just a high level, and there's many ways you can tackle this. So, we looked at doing it with maybe a Power App or a Microsoft Form or, even Microsoft Lists. We thought we would go with just a single page web app. So we built it using Svelte. So it's just a Java or a web framework. So a simple page that we could do all their naming logic. And then we powered everything using function apps. So we basically built PowerShell modules that were basically APIs that interacted with the web page. We stored the web page in Azure static web apps or websites, so cheap blob storage to store your page. And then we were using things like durable functions, Key Vault for securing our secrets or passwords, application insights, and then we were able to talk to all the workloads, so Exchange, Azure AD, as well as Teams.
Yeah, trying to make it cost effective as well, right?
And this is the benefit. So we looked at going Power Apps, but we were going to start using premium connectors. And so this is in Canadian. So what ends up over like I think a 5-month period.
$2 US maybe. 50
so it
cents.
is about $2 US a month. So from that, even licensing one Power App, it doesn't compete to this. So from a consumption-based perspective, this was pretty effective. So let's kind of jump into the breakdown of it. Lost my notes there. So first we have the service account. And so in this organization, they were okay with a named service account that was locked down again with conditional access. So it did have a password. It was a member of Exchange admins, Teams communication admins, and user admins, so be able to deal with licensing, UPNs, phone numbers, and policies. We end up putting the credentials in Key Vault, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So it was just a basic account locked down with conditional access. You can do things like application, go ahead.
Yeah. You limit it to Azure services, the conditional access rule?
Yes, so we used managed identity on the function app to talk to Key Vault, and we put the credentials in Key Vault, and then we use conditional access to lock down the account. And the question was, how are we securing the account? So in this case, but you can use application permissions, you can use certificate permissions depending on the PowerShell module and how much effort you want to do. But if you want to use simple kind of standard commands that you're maybe already using with your team, then you can get a service account. So we also created an Azure application registration. So this registration was for the single page app or SPA. And so this page was using delegation. So one, we wanted the project managers to be able to enter all the information in. And then two, we wanted the application to talk to our functions, pulling out the credentials and using the credentials against our PowerShell commands. Because then that would elevate the ability to build this all out without giving admin roles to the project management. So all our permissions were delegation. We used simple ability to read the profile, to sign into the web app, and then we had the ability to interact with the Teams API as an application. We also used a feature within app registrations called app roles. So in our web page, we actually created a custom role so that if you were a site administrator, you could create a site, and the site was basically part of the naming structure. So we have a site, and maybe you have different buildings within, like, say, a city, and then we can allocate what policies on the team side would apply to that. So maybe what survival branch appliance policy or dial plan or restrictions from that point of view. We also, and not in my demo, but in the app registration, if you go into kind of the enterprise app side, you can lock it down to, let's see, 1 second. Yeah, you can lock it down to assignment required. So this will now say, oh, only the project managers or maybe the team around the room refresh have the ability to use this web app, and then this web app can check out the credentials to provision. So we kind of made sure that, you know, no one could just walk up to it and start provisioning accounts. So make sure you're using, you know, the Azure AD registration properly to kind of lock it down. On the Azure side, so basically put everything in a resource group, very minimal pieces that we needed. So we had Key Vault to store our credentials. We had the function app that had a storage account for all the code. And then we had a storage blob just for the website. So the static web app, again, it was just kind of rendering that code. So what we did with our function app is we went under identity and we turned on managed identity. So this was the ability for our function app to talk to Key Vault. So when we put all our passwords and secrets in Key Vault, the application could check them out without exposing them kind of in text on the app setup. So with that, we had our different kind of credentials that were in there. So what was going to be the default password for common area phones, the default password for MTRs. We also kind of extended out to CyberArk so that we can start generating passwords kind of on the demand, but for this demo, we just kind of had a standard one. And then what is the client secret for the application as well as the password for the service account. And then you can lock down your Key Vault so that only the people that should have access to that do. And then of course, there's auditing and logging in Azure.
Right. So that's where in the access policies, you configure the function ID to say this function is allowed to contact this Azure Key Vault. Right? So that's where you go and apply it in here. Yeah.
That's correct. So we had just that application ID, basically be able to read keys and passwords for the Key Vault. And so what we did was we used the configuration with our function app to call into Key Vault. So if you kind of go in here, you can't actually see the credentials. It's just a reference to the actual specific secret. So when the app runs, it pulls out a Key Vault and puts that into memory. So some of the code, so key thing here is make sure you have like canary testing or health checks. So we just had an endpoint that we can call at any time, and it would basically dump out the state of the modules. So let's just see. So we can call this endpoint. It would make sure, because we were using consumption-based functions, so we could wake up the function from sleep. Make sure that it's able to get a token for Azure AD, a token for being a delegated app for the actual website, talking to Exchange and Teams, and then what was the version of our code, as well as what modules were loaded. So there is a lot of fun, I would say, with dealing with modules in function apps. So don't load the full Microsoft graph. It's massive. It will take forever to spin up your app. So we just named the specific ones that we were calling out, so the submodules. And we had a requirements PSD file in our function app to kind of lock down those versions. Now, function apps try to pull in the latest version of the modules. So the minor updates, or the major updates sometimes get pushed in, or the minor ones, sorry. And so we had to make sure that we were forcing the modules and then double checking that that would happen. constant, we would see like Azure AD or Graph authentication try and slip in a different version. So this was a way to easily spot check to see what was going on. And then we had different issues with the mixing of modules within the same function app. So if you do have struggles, you can always split them out into different function apps, so maybe call each other through APIs. We were lazy, so we stuffed everything into one, and then we just dealt with the complexity. So there is, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but there's certain DLLs that are used by Exchange, Teams, and Graph to authenticate to Azure AD. And those DLLs are different versions, not sure why. So some modules are hard reference to certain versions, some modules aren't, so finding out which one will work with all was a little bit of a fun game. So after all that, we basically had our portal. Again, it's just a single page web app or static app. And so we have as a site administrator, so you can log in, single sign-on. A site admin can come in to add sites, edit sites. And so in this case, we have a site named Calgary. We have our site ID, so what could be picked down from that dropdown. How is it referenced to maybe location or region? And then what buildings can you select within this? Because their naming logic was based on buildings and then city. And then again, what Teams policies apply to that site. So in this case, they're using direct routing, so they had a voice routing policy as well as a specific dial plan per site. So if we go and create a new account, and just double check actually. So in here we have all our accounts that were kind of provisioned through the tool. We also have bulk create, so you can upload a spreadsheet. But in this case, we'll do device ID 8, pick Denver because we're in Denver. We'll pick. So a lot of this naming logic is just for creating the actual display name and the UPN. So we're going to pick location, and we'll say and so in our case, is a wheelchair accessible? So again, modifying the places information. If it was a room that just had a phone, we could turn that on. And let's just say they had some overrides. So generic would just modify the email. Unique would modify the display name. And they had different versions of technology. And let's grab a phone number. And so we would have to have checking logic. So hey, your phone number doesn't actually meet E164 or sorry, enough digits for that location. And then we would check. So all this is powered by function app APIs that are basically PowerShell modules. So in this case, it's going to fail. So it's going to check the data. It's going to notice that the device ID already exists. It'll check if the UPN exists and kind of stop going forward. So as long as my app is not sleeping.
So how long is the process, Michael, from like start to finish from submitting the form? If
So
the app was
we'll
live?
actually time it, and we'll actually get a room signed in once the app wakes up. Okay. So in this case, the device ID exists, so it's not going to prevent or create. So we're going to actually change the device ID, and I'll also change the phone number because I think I used this one before. And so before we run this, I'll just make sure. We're going to create this account that's called Denver RBC Commsverse. So let's just make sure that there's no smoke and mirrors and find if there's any Denver users in here. So none of the Denver users have Commsverse or Comms vNext in there. So we're going to create this right now. So I'm going to check the data. It came back, said, hey, everything's good to go. Create the account. So I'm not sure if you want to time it, but it's about 25 minutes into this left in the session, so let's create the account. So while that's going, I'm going to jump over to our monitoring. So basically, this is just a log stream on the function app. It'll kind of walk through the process. And of course, it was scrolling while I was talking. So we'll kind of go through it. So what it's doing is it makes sure it's verbose. So if anyone needs to troubleshoot what's going on, so basically it went and checked, hey, is all the information's good? And then it says, okay, we can proceed. Then the user hit create. Again, it checked all the data again, because if someone else created it in the meantime while the person was waiting for the results. Then it'll check, it'll create the Exchange account. It will apply a custom attribute to it. Once that custom attribute's there, it'll apply licensing through dynamic groups. Once that comes into Teams, it'll apply all the Teams pieces to that. So let's see where we're at on the status. Okay, so I saw on-prem attribute. It's going to be scrolling. It's probably really hard to read with the light. So let's see where we're sitting right now. So right now it is checking with Teams to see if the account is there. So let's check if this account is in the tenant. So it said it was created. Go under here. So we have our account now showing. We go under, say, properties. We're using a custom attribute. So we should see custom attributes in here somewhere. Right here. So we're using this specific attribute to basically populate a dynamic group that applies the pro license to it. So if we go under groups, we should see that it's a member shortly. So we have that it's been populated through these dynamic groups. On the licensing, we can see that it is probably still processing, so we'll wait for that. Okay. And so we're using durable functions to keep checking. So hey, is the account in Exchange? Is the account in Azure AD? If the account's in Exchange, is the calendar there? If the account is in Teams, wait, if it's not in Teams, wait for the licensing. See what the next one is. And so the reason why we use durable functions instead of sleep is because when you're dealing with the cloud, you never know how long to sleep between tasks. So do we sleep 2 minutes this time? Is it 30 seconds? Is it 5 minutes? Is it 10 minutes? Yeah. So with a durable function, we can just keep monitoring until it's there. And so we can get the shortest period really to full provisioning.
Yeah, and especially because there's throttling in place in M365 as well, right? So if you're doing a lot of these, and if you're doing the bulk side of things, right, you're going to be always constantly trying to trigger all these different events, right?
Oh, I don't have enough licenses for the demo. Perfect. Let's just blow away a couple of these accounts.
Yeah. Yeah, and then I think we're at the end. You're going to talk a little bit around the logic for, the how to handle throttling, from that perspective.
So the account was provisioned and licensed within 3 minutes.
Yeah.
Let's see, but it should still keep checking to see if it shows up in Teams. So that's good. Okay, let's just see if I could. That'd be funny if I deleted the comms one.
Yeah.
Let's see, licenses. Not sure how often it checks.
Yeah. So while we're waiting, I guess in the room, like how many people are going to be doing like large scale account deployments? Like, quite a bit. Like how many we saying?
Probably close to
1,000 rooms over here. Same? Around the same. In the back? 100? Okay. Very cool. And then have you thought about going through like a process like this, or were you trying to understand, how to go through it?
So trying to understand how to go through it, because I came from like the Cisco UC side, so I'm very well versed inside of voice in general, but this is like a whole new beast for me. So
Yes.
my brain hurts watching
Yeah.
you guys play around with it, but it's definitely. So I guess I have a question. Is this proprietary towards your customer, or is this something that we could potentially glean off of and use?
Yeah, so we haven't like open sourced it or anything like that, but it is a custom solution that we offer to customers. But it's just based on PowerShell, right? So if you're comfortable with PowerShell in functions, you can kind of stack the commands that you need to build this.
Yeah, if it's more of like a static kind of, we only have like 1,000 rooms, you can sort of bulk it, using Excel. I tell Dino all the time, all of the deployments that we do, we live in spreadsheet. It's like 90% spreadsheet half the time, right? So, yeah, you can just do sort of the bulk kind of thing. But for this particular customer, they had the bulk side, but then they were constantly going to be provisioning new rooms. So that's why they wanted this custom solution. Sorry.
If we wanted to look more into a solution like this, do you guys have some recommendations for resources online or something that we can research and maybe learn a little bit more about the function app side of things?
Yeah, so on the Microsoft Learn site, you'll have the process of like, hey, we created an account. You have what PowerShell commands you use to talk to Exchange. If you're dealing with Teams and voice, you'll have that kind of side as well. And then on the Azure pages, there's it's easy to kind of build out a PowerShell function app, and it'll kind of give you an example. And then just when you provision it, it'll show you an example. Okay. I think the reprocessing takes a little bit longer than I was expecting. And that's actually a perfect example. So when we create custom code, it's not a building, right? You don't just put it up and then you walk away and it's good forever. APIs change, licensing or environmental things change, especially in your demo with only a couple of licenses. But treat it like a garden, right? It will need nourishment, maintenance. So don't expect that you can build a solution and then that resource might leave. So make sure that you're documenting everything. You have a workflow so that someone else can take it on and maintain it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's pretty big. We were actually talking about that at breakfast today, about how much we all enjoy documentation. And, exactly, and validation testing. It's right, and it was around like these different solutions, especially around like, if you're using like, any of the Power Platform, Power Automate and stuff like that, if the flow is assigned to a particular user and that individual guy or girl leave, then, that Power Automated then gone as well, right? So it's like making sure that you do things properly, document it so that, when people are not gone. And so it was funny. Alex.
Yeah, I've seen that for commenting PowerShell code, ChatGPT is awesome.
Okay.
Really comment and
So for the recording, Alex says that ChatGPT comments code very well.
Yeah, so we have the license and we have the phone number populated, so I think it's in good shape. Just wait.
There was no on-premises account created here, right?
Not in
Correct.
this
It's all
scenario.
cloud-based. Yeah. So if there was, you would just basically create the account on-prem. So you'd have to have obviously the AD connector configured from Azure to be able to communicate with your on-prem infrastructure to be able to fire that new account creation.
I guess you would need a hybrid worker also to send PowerShell commands to on-prem.
That's right. Yeah. Or do it in Exchange and then synchronize on-prem, right? Because
My experience so far has been that identity teams don't seem to care so much about accounts, but they're all over on-premises accounts. So this is pretty slick.
yeah, so I mean, it depends on sort of the organization. Some are like what you're saying, everything is on-prem and then sync with, AAD. Or some of them now are thinking around, especially on the administrator side of things, where they're like, no, everything has to be on-prem, everything has to be on-prem. And now they're thinking, well, if we do it all online and, we can take a little bit more advantage of like the cloud services from a security and risk perspective as well, right? And you can sort of do that as well when you're on-prem and sync to the cloud, especially if you're syncing your password hash. Then you have the ability to take advantage of those, Azure Active Directory, Conditional Access side of things. But it's obviously, it's always a challenge, right? I mean, those are the discussions sort of you have like way ahead of time and say like, these are the things we're going to be doing And then once you build it, you have to have the security team review, depending on the size and what your organization, if you have compliances and stuff like that, sort of walk them through that whole process.
Yeah, and so while the license got reprocessed, the phone number is assigned, direct routing enabled, and the policy tied to the site was applied. So what we're going to do now is log into a room. So this room is back in Calgary in my home office. So let's see if this actually works. So I'm going to exit out. So this is just a fresh room with no configuration. And so as long as I didn't do any typos, I have a pre-configured XML file with the username that we just provisioned and password, so I don't expose it in the demo. And we should be able to just copy it over.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3.
Somehow it passed security.
I was talking about, yeah. So we're going to copy this Skype settings XML. We're going to drop it on the local state. So now when the room reboots, it's going to read that configuration. Make sure I restart it and not sleep it.
Are you manually doing that, or have you figured out how to push the XML file out to the MTR?
So part of our next, and it's always iterating code, so the next kind of iteration of that portal was to have the AV integrator be able to sign into it, and then pick the room, pick the XML, and it would go to the device.
Right. As much fun as that is.
Yes.
I guess you could push the config manager in.
Yeah, there's many ways. You can do it through Intune and push it through that way. And you can write a script, so it's not just the XML, but it could read to your function app, pull the credentials out for that specific account based on its name or something like that. Okay. So that room's rebooting. So while that's rebooting, we still have time. Let's go into some of the findings. So as I mentioned earlier, the PowerShell modules in different versions have a DLL conflict. So what we found was Exchange was the most aggressive on blocking other versions of the DLL. So what we did was, first attempt was to load the Exchange PowerShell module first, and then we were able to use that same DLL for the other modules, Graph and Teams. But when you load Exchange, it doesn't actually load all the DLLs for the module until you do the first command. So what we actually did was just a simple PowerShell script to load the Exchange module if it's not running, and then find the DLLs that it has in the module directory and load those DLLs manually, even if there's no commands. And then we're able to go and get a token for Graph or Teams, and then flip back to Exchange without any issues there. On the bulk provisioning, you get to go into the world of throttling. So when we first did our bulk provisioning, and we were doing everything clean, so we would get a token, do our commands, clear out the token, get another token, do our commands, and then we found out that there's actually a limit on how many times you can request a new token, even if you're clearing out the session within a time frame. So we had to then change our logic so that if we were doing bulk, we would actually check out a token, use it for the bulk, kind of all the interaction with the bulk, and then check it out if before it expires, or check it out when we were done. So we had to make some logic. So again, as you try different scenarios, hey, 5 rooms was fine, 10 rooms was fine, 30 rooms was fine. We went to 50 plus, and it was like, oh, immediately explodes. So make sure you try different scenarios as you're building your code. And then maybe I'll give it back to you on the security one for the bottom, but basically checking out the service account and hitting conditional access.
Yeah, obviously, making sure that when you're using this, if you're using your service principal account, right, making sure that you turn off the MFA for it, make sure you secure it appropriately. Using the key vault was important in order to keep that secure, especially so that no one actually will know what the password is, and then you have specific people that can log in and make the configuration changes for that, right? So, so I guess now the room is up.
Yeah, the room is up and running. Denver, comms next with the phone number up and running in their room. So, I mean, it was a little bit longer than we were hoping, just because of the license processing. But again, within under 10 minutes versus 21 days is pretty good to results.
Yeah, like again, it depends on the size of your organization. You know, when you're looking at the large enterprises, there's a group that perform a specific task. Like as Michael mentioned earlier, there's like an AD team and there's an exchange team, or an identity team, I should say. There's a Teams group.
Yep.
There's a telephony team, right? Where, you know, maybe they do some of the voice in Teams, but maybe you have some, additional infrastructure that you integrate with, like Cisco and stuff like that, and so they manage the phone numbers. All the PRIs or the SIP trunks are coming in there, and you have a, direct routing coming into the cloud. So it all depends on that, and then basically it's just like a ServiceNow ticket that's just bouncing around all these different places, right? In order to get
Not to be
things.
biased, there's other ticketing systems, but
Well, yes, okay, I agree. That's right. Yeah.
But yeah, we find that, giving the credentials to the AV integrator and signing in, that's not when you want to be reverse engineering what is wrong and troubleshooting. Oh, the phone number wasn't assigned, or didn't have the right policy, or conditional access is applying on the device. So, having your process before that, so you're not burning time and money.
Yeah, and then taking the potential errors that could come with it as well, right, out of the mix. So there's a question here.
Yeah, did you say, I missed it, is there a way to do like a bulk upload, you got a new building you're setting up, that sort of thing? You want to do all of those at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, in our solution, we built it for that scenario. So we have, and I have multiple screens. So in here we have the bulk create. The reason why we built everything on PowerShell functions. So it's everything is like kind of API driven. So we built out the web app just to kind of have a way of exposing the API. Eventually, the customer was going to actually do this all from ServiceNow. So they were going to create a ticket, and then they would figure out the naming logic there. It would call the same APIs. We'd validate the address is correct in the naming process, and then make sure that we could provision it.
So is there a sample CSV they can pull down so they get all the headings right? That's
Yeah. So on this bulk side, you can see download example CSV, and it's basically all the attributes. Oh, so the question was, is there a sample CSV that was on the screen? And so you can upload it. We did put a limit of 50 because we didn't have, the ability to, before putting it into production to test, because they were provisioning accounts while we were building this. So we were like, okay, you know what, we'll put a limit on 50 because we've tested that and stamped that. Again, you can, multiple uploads if you needed. We also had a new scenario where they would have an old way of naming or an old account, and they wanted to move it into their cloud-only accounts instead of their on-prem ones, and they wanted to move their meetings. So then that's why there was additional permissions on the app for calendaring and stuff. So they would provision a new account and hit migrate, and then they could reference the old account, and as long as the old account was in Exchange Online, they could move all the meetings, remove the old room, put the new room in, and update all the invites.
Yeah, that's where they wanted the fancy stuff after the fact, right?
Yeah, once you're in Graph, you can do a lot of fun things.
Yeah, so we had a question here.
Yeah, I do have a question. So it kind of goes back to the licensing, one thing that we all love to talk about.
Yes.
So with those Starfish phones that are in the middle of a conference room, and you guys are saying, hey, it's going to need to have the Microsoft Teams Room Pro.
That's great.
Well, can you plop a common area phone license on it and then change the IP phone profile to log in as like a user and account instead? Because to have that Starfish, that's not really doing much from the conference room standpoint. That's pretty a hefty price for something.
So so the question is do you need a Teams Meeting Pro license for the Starfish phones that are in the meeting rooms? So I think the answer is yes, you need a license because of the fact that if you need the one-touch meeting join, they're going to be doing checks on the functionality that you're going to be doing, right? So if you have, you can't just put a user license on these endpoints because they actually are checking. I think it's going to be this July to say that, oh, this is an actual Starfish phone. You cannot have a user license on it unless it's like a user account that I'm logged, like that's in my AD, maybe an executive or something like that.
Yeah, so the kind of licensing EULA or acceptable use is saying if it's a shared device, you can't use user licensing on it. Microsoft's going to start enforcing that. So right now, you could have an MTR that's signed in as the CEO in his office.
Yeah.
Going forward, that licensing is going to change, and so you're going to have a Teams Room Pro license for that device, and you could put you could stack licenses on top of that to make it sign in as the user. But yeah, using like, hey, common area phone in boardroom 1 is signed in as user boardroom 1. Using user licensing is not going to be allowed.
I'm talking more along the lines of forcing it through the IP phone policy of the user sign-in modes.
Yeah, and that won't allow you. Yeah.
Yeah, it trumps.
Because it's breaking my heart.
Yeah, that's a challenge as well, for sure. Any other questions?
And I guess one more. So you basically said you threw out the Teams Room basic license and you don't even look at it anymore?
That's correct.
So, I mean, it's there for us to utilize. Do you have some examples of scenarios where you might actually pick a basic over a pro?
So the question is where, would you use a basic license over a pro? So I think initially, if you're wanting to trial an MTR or something like that, then that's sort of like the process. If you have more than 25 rooms in your organization, you cannot use the basic anymore. Like it doesn't allow you to assign it, right? So basically, as soon as I go above the 25 rooms within the organization, I cannot use the basic license anymore. I have to start using
And I would go even further. If you're going to pilot a room, you're paying for that technology refresh, and then you could put in a license that's kind of hampering it right out of the gate.
Yeah.
That's not even good for a pilot, right? You don't get to use
Yeah.
any of the new features that Microsoft's
Agreed.
building. They're all going to be in the Pro.
Yeah.
You're limited to a single screen, so it's a smaller room. Yeah. So I pretend it's not there, but it is there. But
Yeah, you can use it to sign in, get on the video calls, just if you want to just see how the hardware works. But as Michael said, if you want that enhanced capabilities, like all of the feature set that they're putting in the Pro license, then you go with that, right? So I would, as he mentioned, I think earlier, right, just make sure you trigger the trial license for that so that you can validate, go through all your validation. And then also it gives you the time to validate and go through the procurement process as well, depending on the size of your organization. That could take a significant amount of time as well to get those licenses in your tenant.
yeah. And I would give a shout out again to Durable Functions because it saved our demo.
Yeah.
So basically, even though we didn't have licensing, I was able to correct that. I was able to wait until it showed up in Teams and finish the process. So make sure you're not just using sleep, because sleep will not save you.
Yep. Any other questions? Well, thanks everybody for coming in. Appreciate it.